welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I'm here with the author of a really fascinating book about one of my favorite actors, an interest that has been noted on this show before. And I'm so excited to talk about this fascinating book. Hi, can I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, my name is Zach Schonfeld. I am the author of How Coppola Became Cage.
It's so much fun, and it's such an interesting part of Nicolas Cage's career. Could you start by talking a little bit about, your career and sort of how it may have led you to this book, like how you started writing and sort of how this project came to you?
Sure. So I'm a reporter, journalist, critic, specializing in writing about pop culture, particularly film and music are my two big interest areas. And I worked at Newsweek for 5 years as a senior writer, covering culture. And one of the highlights of my career at Newsweek is that I got to interview Nicolas Cage in 2015 when he was promoting one of like many long forgotten like straight to VOD movies that he was pumping out during that era. It was called Pay the Ghost. Not a very memorable movie, but the experience of interviewing Nicolas Cage for me was super exciting. He's been one of my favorite actors for a long time. I think he's such a shapeshifter as an actor. He's excelled at so many different genres. And part of what fascinates me about Nicolas Cage is that I feel like even in his daily life when he's not acting, he sort of seems like he's acting in a Nicolas Cage movie just because he is such an eccentric and such an enigmatic character, and he lives his life to such an extreme. And even when he's in a bad movie, even when he's like doing a movie that is not particularly memorable, he still commits to the performance to such an incredible degree. So yeah, I was working at Newsweek for 5 years, and Newsweek's parent company went pretty haywire during that time. There was a lot of turmoil, a lot of corruption and layoffs. I ended up getting let go by Newsweek in 2019, and I went full-time freelance. So I started writing for a lot of different publications on a freelance basis. And during my like first year as a freelancer in 2019, I wrote this article about Vampire's Kiss for The Ringer, and the piece was pegged around the 30th anniversary of Vampire's Kiss, which is probably my favorite Cage performance. I think that that is Cage at his like most unleashed. It's like anything. That performance really displays his full like intensity and bravado and wackiness as an actor. So I wrote this piece, and the thing, part of what fascinates me about Vampire's Kiss is that the movie was a total flop when it came out, and only years, if not decades later, was the movie really embraced as a kind of modern cult classic, especially in the era of internet memes and YouTube supercuts. People have really come around on Vampire's Kiss, and it has really found a new audience. So I wrote this piece that I tracked down a lot of the people involved with Vampire's Kiss, the producers, the director, the screenwriter, the cinematographer. And I wrote a piece that, it was kind of like the definitive backstory of Vampire's Kiss. Like, how did this movie get made? What was it like to work with a young Nicolas Cage on, one of his wildest movies? And there were so many amazing stories from the making of that film. The famous story that everyone knows is that Cage ate a live cockroach during the making of the movie on camera because he felt like that was what the character needed. And that piece, so that piece was published by The Ringer in 2019, and it got a lot of attention. Like Cage fans were really excited about it. there were so many like interesting wild stories about his commitment to that film and the wild lengths that he went to in order to portray this character who is going insane and thinks he's turning into a vampire. So that piece was really the inspiration for the book, because that piece is how I got connected with my agent, Barbara Zitwer, who was one of the producers of Vampire's Kiss. She's now a literary agent, which is kind of ironic because Vampire's Kiss is actually a movie about a literary agent who goes insane. Um, but yeah, so after the piece came out, Barbara reached out to me. We got coffee, and she was saying, I think you could do a whole book about Cage, and we kind of shot some ideas back and forth. Or originally we talked about doing a whole book that's just about Vampire's Kiss, but that was a little bit too narrow. I don't think that would have supported an entire book. My idea was, what if I did a book that was like an oral history of Cage in the 80s? What if the book started in 1980 and then ended in 1989, which was when he filmed Wild at Heart, although it didn't come out until 90. But yeah, the idea kind of evolved from there. I decided that I wanted to do a whole book about Cage's early years. Obviously, if you've read the book, you'll know the book begins before 1980. It delves pretty deep into his childhood, because as I was doing this research, I realized that Cage had a very difficult, very turbulent childhood, and and we could talk about that. Some of the experiences that he had during his childhood later were fed into various performances of his. And instead of ending the book in 89, I decided to end with him winning the Oscar for Leaving Las Vegas, which was in the mid 90s. Because I felt like Leaving Las Vegas was the culmination of kind of like the first era of his career. Like, I felt like Leaving Las Vegas was the culmination of his career in independent cinema. And it was a real moment of vindication for him after a lot of people had laughed him off. A lot of people had thought that he was a weirdo who could never really make it as a mainstream star. And then he won the Oscar for Leaving Las Vegas in 96. And after that, his career transformed virtually overnight, and he became a big blockbuster, mega budget action hero. So I decided to end the book right before he became this big Hollywood action hero.
Yeah, I really am fascinated by that time frame, because it does give the story like a nice button, and it also does, as you say, start like a totally new phase. Like, I found it I love that, like, basically, I don't want to spoil this for people, I can cut it if you want me to, but the last line being about, and then he signs up for The Rock, and that really is colors like the rest of his career, kind of, wow.
I really I felt like between Leaving Las Vegas and The Rock, so much changed for Cage, and his career really changed overnight. And all of a sudden, he was working with Michael Bay and Bruckheimer, and he was getting paid like $15 million a movie. Like, he became one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood. So I wanted to end the book right before that point, because the book is really not about his entire career. It's about his origin story. It's about, like, how did this kind of dorky, weird kid named Nicolas Coppola, become a cultural icon. That's why I chose to end the book where I ended it.
Nice. Yeah, so let's talk about his childhood and his family a little bit, because he does, like, throughout his career have like very conflicted feelings about being and has a very just relationship with his uncle and with his father sometimes. So could you maybe talk about that family connection and how that shapes some of his early choices?
Sure. So for any listeners who aren't aware, Nicolas Cage is the nephew of Francis Ford Coppola. His birth name is Nicolas Coppola. And when he was about 8 years old, his uncle directed The Godfather, which obviously became one of the most successful movies of all time. And all of a sudden, Francis Ford Coppola became, one of the most well-paid, celebrated, acclaimed directors in Hollywood, which was very disorienting for young Nicholas, because Nicholas, during that same time period, he was dealing with some really traumatic events in his childhood. His mother was dealing with serious mental illness, and his mom was institutionalized for a number of years during his childhood, and that was really, really difficult for him. I think she had schizophrenia, although it's not entirely clear what she was dealing with. But Cage's father, August Coppola, the older brother of Francis Ford Coppola, um, was this like kind of eccentric literary professor, very unusual man. Um, part of why Cage was so fascinated by movies from a young age is because his father was introducing him to all these artsy avant-garde movies when he was a child. Cage has talked about how when he was a kid, his father would be showing him Fellini movies instead of Disney movies. And his father was really interested in German expressionist films from the 1920s, like Nosferatu, which was a huge influence on Cage. So and Cage was introduced to great literature from a very young age because of his father. But the complicated thing is that my understanding is that Cage's father really resented the fact that after Francis became so successful, the whole Coppola family kind of went into the Hollywood business. Obviously, Francis's children all followed in his footsteps and wound up working in film. And Francis really overshadowed all the other family members. And, I think there was a lot of resentment between August and Francis about the fact that Francis became the golden child of the family. And for this reason, Cage's father really did not encourage him to become an actor. And in fact, he was very much disapproving of Cage's aspirations of being a movie star. And so there was a lot of tension between Cage and his father when he was in high school, and even beyond that. And there's also the fact that Cage, his mother was institutionalized. He was being raised by his father, who didn't really have the time or money to be raising three boys as effectively a single parent. And Cage's father wasn't making a whole lot of money. He was a professor. He was working for Cal State University. And so Cage has talked about how he had this resentment of the fact that his uncle and his cousins, he would go visit them in Northern California, and they were living in this beautiful mansion with a movie theater in their basement. And Cage kind of stewed with jealousy because he lived a much more modest lifestyle. He's talked about how he couldn't even afford to have a car when he was in high school at Beverly Hills High, which was the ultimate indignity for a teenager in Southern California in the early 80s. So Cage had a lot of pent up resentment about the fact that, he had a tough childhood. And so when he started his career and people found out that he was Francis Ford Coppola's nephew, I think a lot of people assumed that he had been born into riches and that he had, been born with a silver spoon in his mouth. And that was far from the truth. He actually had a very difficult childhood. And so part of why he changed his name from Coppola to Cage was because he didn't like people making these assumptions about him. And he especially didn't like people dismissing him as, in the modern parlance, a Nepo baby. People, would think that he only got roles because of who his uncle was, and he wanted to prove that he could make it on his own, and he could get roles on his own merits, which is what he set out to do.
Yeah, it's really movingly told. And I think that that discussion sets up the discussion of his body of work so interestingly, because you kind of break it into phases, of him trying new things, putting on new hats, disposing of tactics, trying a lot of different acting strategies.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that? And maybe what is your favorite of these phases? You talked about your love of Vampire's Kiss. Is it that super experimental, bombastic phase you love, or?
I mean, my favorite Cage performances come from all different eras of his career. So, but I would say I'm very fascinated by that period in his career in the late 80s and early 90s when he had done Moonstruck, and Moonstruck was a big hit, and it became his biggest box office success of the 80s by far. It was nominated for a bunch of Oscars, critics loved it. Cher won the Academy Award. And Cage's response to that was to try to distance himself from Moonstruck as much as possible because he didn't like the movie. He hadn't wanted to do such a gooey romantic movie. He felt like it was too soft. It was too, accessible. And he wanted to be this rebellious bad boy. He didn't want to do mainstream romantic comedies. Which seems funny in retrospect because Moonstruck is a pretty dark movie. It's not some like bland generic romantic comedy. Like it's very morbid. There's a lot of death in it. But yeah, so Cage really lashed out against the success of Moonstruck, which is something I find fascinating. He did Vampire's Kiss right after that. Then he did this weird Italian movie called Time to Kill, which like barely got released in the US, and it is not a good movie at all. And then after that, he did Wild at Heart, which is obviously a very polarizing, violent, rock and roll kind of film. Total David Lynch at his lynchiest. So Cage, part of what I find fascinating about Cage is that he's always like reacting to what he's done before and trying to do something completely different. And this phase of his career where he was just, pursuing the most polarizing and punk rock and, kind of experimental roles that he could possibly find because he didn't want people to pigeonhole him as this, rom-com, moonstruck, handsome boy, falling in love with Cher. And then yeah, so you asked me about the different phases of his career. To rewind a little bit, there was this phase very early on in the early to mid 80s where he was trying to be a method actor, and he was very influenced by his heroes, people like Al Pacino and Robert De Niro and Marlon Brando. And he was particularly, I think he was very influenced by the stories and the legends that he had heard about, these like intense method actors of the 60s and 70s, and how they would, they wouldn't just act, they would live the part. De Niro in particular, there was a lot of mythos around, how De Niro would work like 12-hour shifts as a cab driver when he was doing Taxi Driver, or he would gain 60 pounds in order to try to like live the part of Jake LaMotta for Raging Bull. And then Al Pacino like went so deep into character for Serpico that he would like pretend to be a cop and go around arresting people. Cage was very influenced by those kinds of legends, and he decided that he needed to do that. He needed to live the part. He needed to remain in character 24/7, which is, it sounds romantic when you read about it, but when you actually try to do that, when you're playing a role like the part of Vincent Dwyer in The Cotton Club, Cage plays this really vicious homicidal gangster in that movie, The Cotton Club, and he decided that he needed to live the part, the entire time that he was on the set of The Cotton Club, which became a problem because he started like stomping around, and at one point he destroyed his trailer because he wanted to remain in character as this violent gangster. And at one point he was going around like kicking and damaging like vintage cars that were being used as part of the film set. He was acting really erratic and really crazy because he was trying to live the part of this violent gangster. And gradually he realized you can't do that. Like if you're playing a terrible person on screen, you can't like try to inhabit the role of a terrible person 24/7 because it creates chaos. There's an anecdote that I talk about in the book where he got in trouble on the set of the Cotton Club because um the character that he was playing was very racist and uses racial slurs during the film. And um he started using the racist vocabulary of his character like in between shooting, like just on set. And at one point he used a racial slur, and there was an extra who was black who got really upset with him and tried to fight him. And it like caused all kinds of chaos on set. So, you know, the point of the story is not that Nicolas Cage is a racist. The point of the story is that like he was so determined to remain in character that he was always taking it too far. He was always, you know, doing crazy stunts like that. And I think one of the animating questions of the book for me is, how far can you go for a film performance? How far can an actor really go in order to inhabit the character that they're playing on screen? And how far is too far? Like, how far does Nicolas Cage take it? And does that result in a great performance, or does it just distract from the performance itself? Like, how far can one man go for the sake of a film performance? I think that's been a recurring theme throughout Cage's career.
Hmm. Yeah, he loves testing boundaries. It seems like, like within himself and
Definitely.
like, the people around him.
Definitely. Yeah.
Mhm. I'm glad you brought up Cotton Club and that anecdote, and as well as some of the others, because there are like a lot of really great interviews that are sort of represented in this book too, throughout your research and interviews you've done in the past and for this. And so I'm wondering about like when you are interviewing, and I imagine there's like
Mhm.
kinds, right? Because there's the ones that you're getting anecdotes, but there's also sort of like the journalistic due diligence that's at work
Right.
too, right? So like
Right.
how do you approach interviews and like bringing up these like like stories that might still be a little bit of like touch points or sore spots for people, like how do you approach those like difficult subjects?
That's a good question. One thing that I learned while writing about Nicolas Cage for that Vampire's Kiss piece, that piece kind of taught me that like everyone who's ever worked with him has a story that has stuck in their head for 20 or 30 or even 40 years. Like everyone who has ever worked with Nicolas Cage has a memorable story about how intense he is, or how much he commits to a performance behind the scenes in ways that viewers might not even understand. So when I was interviewing sources for this book, I was really um trying to like get anecdotes out of them. I was trying to jog their memory, and I was really saying like, what's your best Nicolas Cage story? Like, you worked with him on this film 30 some odd years ago. Like, what is the craziest thing he did? What was your impression of him? What has stuck in your memory for all these years? And pretty much everyone has a story. Like for instance, I interviewed David Lynch for the book, and David Lynch loves talking about Cage, how Cage sang those Elvis Presley songs in Wild at Heart. And, that wasn't even in the original shooting script. That's something that like Lynch and Cage just like came up with when they were talking on set during the shoot. Like, and Cage committed to it. Cage um, really dove into the whole Elvis Presley theme. Um, I interviewed Martha Coolidge, who directed Valley Girl, and she has an amazing story about how she had Cage audition for the movie, and she didn't even know that he was Francis's nephew. She just picked his headshot out of the reject pile and was like, we need someone who looks like this, and brought him in without having any idea who he was. Um, it's um, it's complicated because the book is about events that happened 30 to 40 years ago, and there were a lot of competing versions of stories. A lot of people remember things differently. I'll give you an example. Like, um, Cage himself in old interviews has told a story about the making of Racing with the Moon, which was one of his very first roles. It's this period piece that came out in '84. He he has told a story, that was during his method acting phase where he was working with Sean Penn, and he was very influenced by Sean Penn's attempts to be a method actor. And according to Cage, during the shooting of that film, at one point uh he wanted to feel real pain. He wanted to feel the pain, the emotional pain that his character was feeling. So he took out a pocket knife and he literally cut his arm and started bleeding because he felt like that would be a shortcut in order to feel the pain that his character was feeling, which is a crazy thing to do. And according to Cage's account, the director, Richard Benjamin, was like, "What are you doing? Like, cut it out, man. Like, this is not that kind of movie." The director actually reprimanded him. And I interviewed Richard Benjamin for the book. He's in his early 80s now, and he had a lot of very vivid memories of working with Cage and Sean Penn on that movie, but he had no memory of Cage cutting himself, and that particular anecdote he didn't remember. He said, "As far as I'm concerned, I don't think that ever happened." So, and this kind of thing happened a lot where someone remembers it one way and someone else remembers it another way. And so it was really tricky to fact check that kind of stuff because memory, the human memory is obviously very fallible. People often remember things differently than the way it actually went down. I don't know if the knife story really happened and maybe Richard Benjamin doesn't remember it. Or perhaps Cage invented the story in order to build this mythos around himself, because that's another complicating factor of the book, is that Cage, I don't think he made up stories, but he definitely exaggerated stories for the sake of his own reputation, and he was trying to build a legend around himself. And so for example, in the book, I talk about the wisdom teeth. The story is that Cage was playing a Vietnam vet in the 1984 film Birdie, which is a great film, very underrated Cage performance. And he was so determined to try to live the part of he plays this guy who got part of his face blown up in combat in Vietnam, and he was so determined to try to live the part that he wore bandages on his face for weeks on end. He refused, he slept in his bandages, refused to take them off. And he went around telling people that he had 2 teeth pulled in order to feel the pain that his character was feeling, because his character had been wounded in war. And he told interviewers, like he would tell the story to interviewers in '84 and '85, where he was like, I had my teeth pulled out in order to feel pain when I was shooting Birdie. And the story kind of like became this legend that was passed down. Like if you read any magazine profile of Cage from the '80s or early '90s, like there's a very good chance that it's going to mention like, this actor is so crazy that he had 2 teeth pulled out for the sake of a performance. The truth is he was exaggerating. The actual fact of the matter is he had wisdom teeth that had not come out on their own, and they needed to be removed for like legitimate dental reasons. And so this was like a fully necessary dental procedure. The teeth needed to be removed. Like at one point he claimed that he had teeth pulled out without Novocaine. That was totally not true. Later he admitted that like it was a legitimate dental procedure. He used Novocaine. Like, there wasn't anything that crazy about it. The teeth needed to come out, but he went around telling people that he had teeth pulled just for the sake of a performance, and people ate it up. It became this like very very alluring, juicy story about how intense Cage is. And it became part of his legend. So he was deliberately and knowingly trying to build up this legend around himself, and it worked because he certainly, accrued a reputation as this incredibly intense method actor who would do anything for a performance. And so one of the challenges of the book, and you know, I'm not sure I always succeeded at this because it's hard to do. But one of like the core challenges of this book is I wanted to try to separate fact from myth. I wanted to try to figure out like what of the many stories that have been told, of the many rumors and legends that have spread about Nicolas Cage's early career, I wanted to figure out what is true and what is bullshit, and you know, how can we separate the fact from the myth here? How can we verify what actually went down on the set of Birdie or Vampire's Kiss or Peggy Sue Got Married or any of the myriad other classic films that he made during this era.
Mm. Yeah, it is a very complicated task. And, I think it plays into, as you say, his own participation in his myth making. And
Right.
which always struck me as weird, because that he is so also conflicted about like his memification and sort of the place he occupies in pop culture, because that seems a little contradictory, like can you talk about that a little bit, because he does seem to
Yeah.
create a lot of mystique, and legendary stories and like exaggerated like eccentricity. But then he's also very uncomfortable with like how he is received like by the culture.
Yeah. So the memes, it over the past 10 to 15 years, it's been interesting to see Cage become an internet meme. There are these reaction gifs and memes that started spreading on the internet, I would say around 2010, 2011, especially like screenshots of him making those crazy expressions in Vampire's Kiss. And there were YouTube supercuts that went viral during this period. I think the big one that got a lot of attention was like a supercut of Nicolas Cage losing his shit, and it's basically just like a master cut of Cage in like all different movies from throughout his career, just like screaming and cursing, and there's the famous clip of him in Deadfall, like walking through a strip club screaming the word fuck at the top of his lungs, and the clip from Zondali where he's pouring black paint all over himself and screaming black it out, black it out. So it's interesting because like on one hand, these supercuts and memes definitely contributed to his legend and his mythos, and a lot of people really delighted in celebrating his wackiness and his turning him into this subject of internet fascination. I think it became an expression of a lot of people's fandom and expression and obsession with Nicolas Cage. But on the other hand, there was something frustrating about it, certainly to Cage himself. And Cage has talked about how he didn't like the fact that people were treating him as a joke and as a punchline. And, when it comes to the memes and the supercuts, he didn't like the fact that they were taking these moments out of context. And I can understand that, because when you watch the supercuts, like some of these are great movies, some of them are not great movies, but like when he has these freakouts in movies, like there's a context for it. Like you need to understand what brought the character to this place of insanity. Why is he screaming and throwing the table over at the casino and leaving Las Vegas? There's a whole narrative that brings the character to this place of despair. And it was very disturbing for Cage to see his performances being taken out of context. I didn't know that he had I didn't know that the memes were such a sore spot for Cage until 2015. It was in 2015 that I interviewed Cage for Newsweek, and I briefly talk about this in the book, where I asked him about the memes, and I during that interview I asked him, like, what do you think about the internet treating you as a meme? And he answered the question. He gave a pretty brief, polite answer where he said something like, "Oh, I just try not to think about it too much because I don't have much control over that." And then after this was a phone interview that I did for Newsweek magazine, and after we got off the phone, the interview was over. The publicist who had set up the interview called me back and it was like, can you cut that question from the interview? Like we don't like, we don't really want you asking Nicholas about the memes. Like, can you just not publish that in the interview? And I was really taken aback because, when I do interviews with celebrities, I don't agree to any like preconditions of what I'm allowed to ask them. So the question was fair game.
Mm.
And I had to get my editor on the phone with this publicist, and my editor stood by me and said, like, this was a fair question. There's no reason for us to cut this from the interview. This is fair game. It was a completely reasonable question. And I remember the publicist got a little bit upset and was like, well, if you're gonna publish that question, we'd rather you just spike the whole interview. And we were like, what are you talking about? Like, we're not gonna spike the interview because you don't like a question that I asked your client. Like, that's not how journalism works. But that was memorable. That was it was really interesting. I don't know if Nicolas Cage was the one who was so upset about the question, or if it was just the publicist was trying to do some sort of damage control. But that was when I realized that he's very sensitive about the way the internet has kind of turned him into a joke. And sometimes he's gone along with the joke. Like, he did that SNL segment with Andy Samberg back in 2012, where he was kind of, he was game to play along with Andy Samberg's impression of him. But then other times he's been very sensitive about it. And there's a quote in my book from Cage's brother, Christopher Coppola, where Christopher talks about how he convinced Cage to reprise the character of Eddie in Deadfall in the movie Arsenal, which was really, really a terrible movie in my opinion. But because Cage's performance in Deadfall had kind of like become part of those YouTube supercuts, Christopher was able to convince his brother to revisit that character in a new film, which was a truly bizarre thing to do because the character actually dies in Deadfall. He actually dies in a deep fryer in like a really gruesome death scene. But anyway, yeah. So the memes are interesting. Vampire's Kiss has certainly become a repository of Cage memes. And I think that certainly is part of the reason why that film has been embraced as a cult classic by a lot of younger fans. But at the same time, it frustrates me when people talk about Vampire's Kiss as being a joke movie. I know it frustrates Cage as well. Like, I don't like it when people say things like, "Oh, like it's a good bad movie. Like, it's one of the best bad movies ever." Like that, I find that frustrating because I feel like it's a way for people to kind of like express fondness for a movie while asserting their own superiority over it. There's something very smug and disdainful about that, which I personally I don't like that. But yeah, the memes are complicated. On one hand, they've definitely helped bring Cage back to public prominence, but they've also reduced him to a bit of a punchline. And I very much wanted my book to explore Cage as a human being and not a meme. I really wanted my book to like go behind the memes, behind all the internet jokes and silliness around Cage, and try to like portray him as a complicated human being and artist.
You brought up such a good point, that it does, like, those supercuts do kind of reduce him to like a one-note actor, because like all
Right.
the course do have like really like have context in which they make a lot more sense sometimes, than when you see them just all in a row.
Right.
Yeah, wow. And like that is absolutely explains why he would have such a mixed feelings about it. And I do think this book does a great job of getting at the real person behind the memes.
Yeah, I definitely one of my key goals with the book was to try to demythologize Cage, try to dig deeper than all of the memes and stories and rumors about him, because there's so much like silliness and wackiness around him, and I wanted to figure out like who is the real guy, like who was he before he was Nicolas Cage, who was he when he was Nicolas Coppola, and also like why has he made, he's made a lot of strange and surprising choices throughout his career, and I wanted my book to really dig into like why did he agree to do a movie like Vampire's Kiss in the first place? Why did he do a crazy performance like Deadfall, where he's wearing that ridiculous mustache and toupee and he's shouting in a strip club? Like what animates him behind the scenes? What is the guiding force behind some of these ridiculous, wacky, out of this world performances that he's done? And I hope that my book will help people have a deeper understanding of his body of work.
Yeah, yeah. What you get is like a portrait of a person who has like made choices rather than it's just like a random chaos agent, like
Exactly. Yeah.
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 Gosh, well, thank you so much for joining us. Do you think you will ever write another book about like a film career like this, or do this sort of like deep investigation into a person's body of work?
Um, I'd like to. I don't think I'm going to write another unauthorized biography, because I will say that one of the most stressful parts of writing this book is the fact that Cage didn't participate. He declined to participate in the book, which meant that a lot of people who I would have liked to interview every time I would reach out to a publicist requesting an interview, Hollywood publicists are they're very much gatekeepers of talent. They are very selective about who they will allow their client to talk to. And so a lot of publicists were like, is this an authorized biography? Is Cage aware of the book? Is Cage participating in the book? And so it was frustrating for me that, I wasn't able to interview everyone who I wanted to interview for this book, especially because Cage wasn't participating in the book. So I'd really like to try to write an authorized biography of a celebrity. I'd like to write a book about an actor or a director who will actually participate in the book and cooperate with me. But yeah, I haven't I don't I'm still trying to figure out what my next book is going to be. So that's all up in the air right now. But I definitely want to write more books about movies. I really enjoyed the challenge and I really enjoyed the experience of just immersing myself in Cage's filmography for 3 years and just trying to learn everything I possibly could learn about this one artist's career.
I hope you get to do it again, because I had a lot of fun reading this one. And next time.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Okay, listeners, it is your turn. I highly encourage that you go and check out How Coppola Became Cage. It's available at your favorite library or independent bookstore right now. So please go check it out. You won't regret it. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.